Microphone check, 2, 3, microphone check. Microphone test, microphone test. Okay.
Good evening. I'm glad to see you and to be together, especially this week. Earlier today, somebody came into my office and asked for a quick primer about Gaza, when Israel controlled it, when Israel didn't control it. And I know it's presumptive to talk about history before a history lecture, and I'm certainly not an expert in the way that Professor Burke is, but I did want to just highlight a couple of important dates and times, which I think will help with some context. This has nothing to do with this lecture. I just wanted to take the opportunity to spend 3 minutes on this. Before the State of Israel was founded, there were areas of the land of Israel that had greater density of Arab populations, and there were areas that had greater density of Jewish populations. And when the United Nations created the partition plan of 1947, they basically erred on the side of areas that had big Arab populations were going to be part of the Arab state. Note, not a Palestinian state, because they didn't really think of themselves as Palestinians at that time, but the Arab state, and areas that were predominantly Jewish were going to be parts of the Jewish state. And Gaza was in a predominantly Arab population and was part of the areas that were supposed to be part of the Arab state of that partition plan. We all know what happened. The Arabs said, no partition. And the Jews said, yeah, we'll take whatever you're willing to give us. And in 1948, Arab nations from all around attacked the fledgling state of Israel, and they said at that time to the Arab folks living in areas that were going to be Israel, they said, leave your homes, we'll wipe the Jews into the sea, and then you can come back. It's also true that some Arabs did not leave, and that the Israeli forces expelled Arabs. That is also true. Both of those things are true. They were told by Arab leaders to leave, and they were expelled by Jews. Some of those folks ended up as refugees in Gaza. At the end of that war, in April 1949, there was an armistice line drawn. We call that armistice line the Green Line. Okay? And it's mostly between the West Bank and Israel. That's the West Bank of the Jordan River, as opposed to the East Bank, which is the country of Jordan, or then it was called Transjordan. The West Bank most of the armistice line is there at the West Bank. But Gaza and Sinai were occupied by Egypt, and there was also an armistice line around Gaza. So at that time, Gaza was controlled by Egypt. Okay? And there were some of the Arab population that had been there before the war, and there were some refugees from that war who were also there. That was the case until 1967, when Israel conquered the Sinai Peninsula as part of a defensive war. Israel gave back the Sinai Peninsula right away, and that included Gaza, which was in the control of Egypt. That was that agreement around the Suez and whatever. Then Egypt escalated again and wouldn't let the Israeli boats come out, and there was another war, the 1973 war, which Professor Burke talked about last week, that we observed 50 years anniversary of it, and last Friday on October 6th. At the end of the 1973 war, Israel again controlled all of Sinai, and that included Gaza. So from 1973, Israel has controlled Gaza from a military perspective. In 1978, Israel made peace with Egypt, 78, 79, and in that peace agreement, Egypt wanted to take back Sinai, but refused to take back Gaza. Egypt didn't want anything to do with the people who lived there, or with the governance of them, or with anything to do with it. And part of the agreement with Egypt that has lasted since we made peace with Egypt in the late 70s is that Egypt controls one of the borders with Gaza. From 79 until 2005, Egypt controlled one border of Gaza, and Israel controlled the rest of the border of Gaza, and there was some Jewish settlement in Gaza. In 2005, Israel removed all Jews from Gaza as part of what was called the disengagement. And at that time, or close to that time, there was an election among the Palestinians. Hamas, a terrorist organization with a charter dedicated to the eradication of Jews everywhere in the world, and especially to Zionist Jews in Israel. It's explicit in their charter. This is an organization bent on destruction. They were elected in some kind of election, the leaders of Gaza. And since 2005, 2006, Egypt has closed one of their borders, Israel has closed one of their borders, and the life of an average Gazan is really very miserable. And their leadership are these terrorists who don't care about the value of human life, and who use civilian buildings like hospitals and schools as storehouses for their weapons and training facilities for their fighters. Israel has not, with the exception of a couple of times, gone into Gaza since 2005. When people say that Gaza is the world's largest open-air prison, what they're talking about is not like cells, like you imagine a prison. What they're talking about is the lack of freedom of movement that the average Gazan citizen has. Like I said, it is really rough to be a Gazan. If you could choose from the veil of ignorance before you were born of where you would want to live in the world, that would probably be your last choice. It is not a nice place to live, and not the least of which because the leadership of that place are bloodthirsty murderers, as they showed the entire world this week. I hope that helped, maybe to give some context and history to the moment that we're having right now. I do want to say also that the casualty count has gone up to over 1,300 Israelis, including 200 Israeli soldiers. There have also been hundreds of Palestinians killed, most of whom are Palestinian Hamas terrorist fighters, but some also civilians that were killed. That is also true, but the vast majority are Hamas fighters, and there are about 1,000 deaths in Gaza, plus the 1,500 Hamas terrorists who infiltrated the south of Israel. It is now clear that Hamas infiltrated the south of Israel with the purpose not just of killing Jews, which they did indiscriminately, children, young people, old people, and which they took more than 130 hostages, prisoners into Gaza, including some American citizens. Their goal was not just to kill Jews. Their goal was also to take territory. It is now clear from intelligence gathering that there was a particular goal, and the goal was to take towns in southern Israel and to expand Hamas land from Gaza to also be sections of Israel. The destruction in the Eshkol region, which is our partnership region, is completely horrible. And I encourage you all to stay up to date, not by scrolling through video after video from Instagram or TikTok or Facebook. Just stay out of that, because you can't unsee what you see. But to get the information from Federation when they send it out, or from reputable news sources, it's very important to stay up to date. And before Professor Burke begins, I just want to give this prayer for the release of those who are missing or held captive. A prayer for the welfare and return of Israel's captured and missing from among our family. God of Israel, our rock and our redeemer, God of mercy, of compassion, we pray, we plead that you return these precious and beloved people, the captured and the missing, who have cruelly and heartlessly been torn from their homes and carried off to our enemy's territory. We are terrified, contemplating their fate, horrified at the thought of the sufferings of the missing and captured who are not yet within our power to reach, and so we plead before you, source of mercy, be at their side. Support them, protect them, and quickly bring them back to the embrace of their families and all who love them, as you have declared, behold, I will restore the captives of Jacob's tents and have mercy on their dwelling places. We beseech you, Adonai, quickly fulfill your word. Here I am with you, I will watch over you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. Indeed, I will not leave you until I have done what I have said for you. Amen. Thank you for indulging me and listening to my brief summary. I want to say that, like I said on Monday night at the Federation Solidarity event, that everything that I see from my family who are serving and my family who are not serving and my friends who are there in Israel right now is that morale is high, even in the face of hundreds and hundreds of funerals, and even in the face of great upheaval. 300,000 reservists have been activated in Israel, and some units are reporting greater than 100% attendance, which means that people who are in that unit who weren't called up showed up anyway. The people on the home front are packing packages and sending food. Every day I'm seeing videos of restaurants in Tel Aviv that are treif restaurants that are koshered to be able to send kosher food to the front lines. And many, many, many other examples of the strength and power and resilience of the Jewish people. Am Yisrael Chai. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Burke to give us our third lecture. I'm sure he might also have something to say on this topic, and also the third lecture in our series about the great books and the ideas that really have the power to change the course of history. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friends, for coming, and a good evening to all of you. And again, a special greeting to the people on Long Island. What happened, of course, was a tragedy, but it was a tragedy beyond a tragedy. Again, it's hard to talk about these things and to stay calm. The killing of babies, the burning of people alive, the raping of women and girls, taking people, kidnapping people, all these things are very difficult to deal with. but for want of a better expression, a better cliche, this is a quantum leap above anything that has taken place before. Let me suggest to you, if you remember your colleges and your universities, see what they're saying now. Look at what the presidents of these institutions are saying, and if they're not saying the right thing, don't give them a dime. Even at Union College, it was a good statement, but really there was a lot left out there. What should be said is that this was a war, to put it another way, for those of you who have studied the Holocaust with me, this is reminiscent of the behavior of the Einsatzgruppen. These were mobile killing squads that the Germans had, the SS had, that roamed behind the lines of the advancing German army and killed every Jewish man, woman, and child that they could find. They put babies on bayonets, they buried people alive, they set fire to them. This should be said. This is really important. It is different. There's war, and there's this type of thing. Hamas did exactly what it said it would do. That is, in its founding charter of 1988, it called for the destruction of the State of Israel. And when the supporters of Palestine say that we want a Palestine between the river and the sea, you don't have to be a wizard of geography to understand what that means. The river is the Jordan, the sea is the Mediterranean, and if there's a state between the river and the sea, there is no state of Israel. Now, already people are talking about not why this happened, but looked on the other side. How is Israel taken so much by surprise? And the failure here is, well, I go back to something that I said to you last week. Remember, last week I spoke to the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. Why was Israel taken by surprise? Bad intelligence. When this is all over, somebody's going to have to do some real soul-searching here. The Mossad, supposedly the best intelligence organization in the world, the CIA, not far behind, all the technological stuff, and they didn't understand it. Now, there's more to that than what I just said to you. When I spoke to you last week, I talked to you about a failure of conception. And by that I mean, in 1973, the Israelis, suffering for a certain amount of hubris that flowed from their great victory in the Six-Day War, the Israelis believed that the Egyptians and the Syrians neither had the ability nor the courage to launch an attack against them. Israel felt the same way about Hamas. In addition to that, here's the real conception. And there's a transcendental question that we really have to deal with. Because it doesn't end here with Hamas. Because the same issue is raised with Iran. And the question is, the transcendental question is, how do you deal with evil? It is as simple as that. How do you deal with evil? The Israeli failure was to think that the evil of Hamas could be contained. That is, we'll allow 18,000 people from Gaza to go to work. They will make an income because there's massive unemployment in the Gaza Strip. Surely Hamas would not go to war because it would disrupt that flow of workers into Gaza, workers into Israel. In addition to that, the Israelis allowed a certain amount of food, a certain amount of goods to come in there. It was believed that Hamas could be managed, but it couldn't be managed. History has shown when people say they are going to kill Jews, they usually do so. On January 30th of 1933, in a long speech, the last part of the speech, Hitler said to the Jews of Europe, if you plunge Europe into a war, you will be annihilated. The war came. It wasn't the Jews that started. Hitler started it. And yet 6 million Jews would die. So the point here again is Hamas talking about the murder of Jews, talking about the destruction of the State of Israel, and the Israelis, and like many of us, in our State Department and in our presidents, and it doesn't make a difference who is a Republican or a Democrat, they all believed. And again, on rational grounds, they were right. Surely people who are responsible for governing an area and people who are responsible for the well-being of 2.5 million people would not want to make their living precarious. Surely they would want to carry out and benefit economically. It was the logical thing to do. But it's a good example how the Marxists were wrong. It's not economics that determines politics, it's politics that determine economics. The aim was to destroy the state of Israel. And we, in effect, Hamas was saying, we don't give a damn about the well-being of the people here, the economics of the situation. We are concerned with destroying Israel. So that is a really important issue here. And the other one, and this is the one I think now and in the future, Israelis are going to, God bless you, have to have some very, very difficult questions. The very reason for being of the state of Israel is to protect Jews. That was always the bottom line of Zionism. When Herzl, who was not a religious man, he wasn't talking about God giving the Jewish people this land. For him, there had to be a place where a Jewish mother could go to sleep at night, not having to worry about somebody sticking an ice pick in her child's brain. The ultimate bottom line of Zionism was to protect the Jewish people, and the government of Israel did not do that. That's the real issue here. And that's what's going to cause a lot of people who are thinking of making Aliyah and people who are living in Israel who have to debate. They don't like to say it publicly. Should we stay here? Israel failed. It failed to do the basic task that every government is required to do, and that is to defend its people and guarantee their security. And that's going to be a problem. Why did it happen that way? Well, you can say a number of things. Too much concerned about the West Bank, right? Most of Israeli attention was focused on the West Bank. Israeli military units were pulled out from the area around Gaza and went to the West Bank because most of the terror emanated from the West Bank. That's it. That's a fact of life. And something else. And then I'll leave this and we'll go into the subject of the evening. I told you that evil exists in the world. We all know that. And sometimes evil cannot be managed. Sometimes you can't negotiate with evil countries and evil people. You couldn't negotiate with Nazi Germany. We tried to negotiate with Imperial Japan. That didn't work. Now the issue before us, as I said in the beginning, there's another center of evil, much more dangerous than Hamas. Hamas is an organization. It is not a state. Iran is a state of 80 million people. Iran, from its very founding, the Islamic Republic, has called for the destruction of the state of Israel. The two Ayatollahs, Ayatollah Khomeini and Ayatollah Khamenei, both speak about wiping Israel off the face of the earth. And as I've said to you before, there's a digital clock in Tehran that counts down minute by minute from the year 2040, because the Islamic Republic and the two Ayatollahs have said that sometime before 2040, Israel is going to be destroyed. So what do you do? That is the question. I know what the answer is. Don't get upset what I'm going to tell you. I'm not the only one who says it, but it's risky business. Iran has to be attacked. The nuclear infrastructure of Iran has to be destroyed, and if possible, the Islamic government has to be toppled. I know that's a difficult thing. Nobody wants war. Nobody wants war. Now, I am not a rabbi. I'm not a Talmud Chacham. But I'm so sure some of you remember a very important adage in the Talmud. If someone comes to kill you, kill him first. That is the predicament. And the predicament of Israel is that its greatest ally, the United States, is reluctant to do that. And I can understand that. After all, that digital clock is not ticking down for the elimination of the United States of America. It is ticking down for Israel. If you're not Jewish and you're not an Israeli, I'm not sure many people are concerned about all of this. I was saying to some people, I'm teaching at Union 56 years. I know many of the people there in my department for 35 years. Only one person at that school in the faculty has come over to me and said, I'm sorry. Only one. Only one person. And interestingly enough, 2 other people came over to me, 3 other people. They're on the staff, not the administrative staff, but people who work in the kitchen and people who work in the mailroom. A lesson in how sometimes a higher education doesn't create any decency or empathy. So the point here is, I'm among those who say that Iran has to be attacked because they're going to destroy the state of Israel if they're not challenged, if they are not really, that nuclear capacity is not eliminated. Can Israel do it by itself? The answer is yes. But it can only be done if its greatest ally, our country, gives it the assistance that it needs. The assistance is the real, the important, the really significant bunker-busting bombs. No administration has given Israel that. Israel must have it. Israel must be able to count on American refueling planes that can refuel Israeli planes when they return from Iran, if they're here. And if I haven't shocked you enough, because once again, I believe that Iran, if its nuclear capacity is not checked, Israel must be able to use every weapon in its arsenal, including a tactical nuclear weapon. You're going to walk out of here and say, this guy Burke is a right-wing lunatic, he's a Neanderthal man, he's a saber rattler, he's not concerned about the well-being of civilians. I'm telling you, I'm not a prophet. Our tradition says that the age of prophecy ended with Micah. He's the last prophet, there are no other prophets. But as sure as I'm standing here, if that nuclear capacity is not destroyed, if the Islamic Republic remains in place, Israel will be attacked. And you don't have to be, I know we have atomic scientists here, I will tell you, and I'm not a scientist, one 20-kiloton bomb exploded over Tel Aviv means that Israel ceases to be a viable country. And given the religious fanaticism of Iran, the day may come when somebody in that Islamic Republic says, yep, we know the Israelis have nuclear weapons, we know that they will respond, but when the smoke clears, we will be here and they will not be, and therefore we attack. I know you didn't like what I had to say to you. In the short run, I will tell you that American Jews and all supporters of Israel must bring as much pressure to bear on the Biden administration, on Secretary of State Blinken, to give Israel a free hand. Until those hostages come home, Israel should be able to do whatever it wants. Because a real tough policy in Gaza, yes, it means the death of civilians. I know that. The death of civilians, the destruction of property, if we're lucky, may lead to a deterrent value, a deterrent aspect. At the very least, Hamas has to be destroyed. Because they will come again and again and again. This is grim news I'm giving you. And there are people that I think would disagree with me. Thank God we live in a free country. People are free to express anything that they want. When I finish with the topics at hand, Then I'll ask you if there are any questions, and I'll even let you vent. But before we remember, we have to finish before Shavuos. So when you vent, make it quick. All right, let's get moving. When does history change? When is there a turning point? When I was an undergraduate, and they taught courses in modern European history, a survey course in modern European history, the year was 1815. And why? Because that's the Battle of Waterloo, and that, of course, is when Napoleon was defeated and Europe goes into a post-Napoleonic period. Today, we don't say 1815. We use the year 1789. That's the year of the French Revolution, which unleashed forces that really resonate down to the present day. I mention this to you because the question is, when does Jewish history change? And Jewish history changes in the middle of the 18th century. You remember when I spoke to you about John Locke last week, or 2 weeks ago? I spoke to you about John Locke. I spoke to you about the coming of the Enlightenment. There were a very, very small number of young Jewish men that actually read Locke. And they read Hobbes. And they read Goethe. And they read other people. These are the people who have been to create what in Hebrew is known as the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. And the man most associated with the Haskalah and the Jewish Enlightenment is this man. He had a spinal defect, whatever he had, small man from a very poor family. His father's name was Mendel, and that's why he called himself Mendelssohn, the son of Mendel. This is Moses Mendelssohn. Comes from the small German town of Dessau, and because he is a very, very bright and precocious young man, his father and other people in the town scraped together enough money, and they take him, they let him go to Berlin, where there are some very, very enlightened people. Succinctly put, this is a young man that will learn Latin and Greek and Russian and Polish and English and, of course, German as well. He is fluent in Yiddish, but he believes that Yiddish is jargon, that Yiddish is not a language of civilized people. He was wrong in that, but that's the way he felt. What he is going to do, this disciple of the Enlightenment, is to write a number of things. Among them, what is called the Beur. This is a German translation of the Torah. For Moses Mendelssohn, the fact that the Jews in his time, most of the Jews, did not speak German was a retarding factor in their ultimate emancipation. That as long as they did not speak the language of the country in which they were in, people would look upon them as aliens. This is a man who believes in a certain amount of assimilation. So he takes the Torah, translates it into German in Hebrew letters. He translates the Torah into Hebrew letters. So those young men, usually young men, who were fluent in Hebrew, now would be able to learn German. Just to give you an example, Mishka, correct me, where are you there? I know you're there somewhere, right? What does our Torah begin? Bereshit, right? In the beginning. In his translation, it's in Am Anfang, in the beginning. Do you understand that? He's translating the Torah into German using Hebrew letters, enabling the German Jews to learn the German language. Much in the same way that Martin Luther translated the New Testament into German. So the point in all of this is a man who is to a certain degree is an assimilationist. This is a great man, a good and decent man, a man that suffers from all sorts of problems and in fact had a nervous breakdown. Largely, we believe, as a consequence of the attacks that come forth against him. He's always forced to defend the Jewish people. And so he writes a number of books. One of them is this book, Jerusalem, in which he says virtually the same thing, among other things, that John Locke had said. No government has the right to suppress any religion. The way to protect individual conscience is to separate the church or the religion from the state. That's important stuff. And his book in Jerusalem, he's not talking about, this is a man that if he lived 100 years later, in all likelihood would be a fervent anti-Zionist. This is a man that believes we're not talking about the Jerusalem in heaven. We're not talking about the Jerusalem in Eretz Yisrael. We're talking about creating a Jerusalem right here in Germany, where there's a pluralistic society, where are different religions, and the state respects all of these religions. But more than that, look at us here. Think of yourselves. With the exception of the rabbi, none of us had a really broad religious education. What did we study? Mathematics, physics, chemistry, right? All the secular subjects, the sciences as well. That's what Moses Mendelssohn said we should do. If you want to be accepted, and you want to benefit from modernity, and you want to be emancipated, in effect, these are not his words, you got to shape up. You got to learn the German language. You got to be familiar with secular subjects. Then, he thought, the Jews will be emancipated. But be very clear here, and he was very clear. What's the expression that is associated with him when he addressed the Jews? Be a Jew in your tent and be a man of the world on the street. In other words, you do not abandon the religion. And as much as he said you should learn the German language, he also said you've got to learn Hebrew as well. Hebrew is the language of our people. He was straddling a very difficult line here. On the one hand, assimilation, and on the other hand, again, clinging to one's Jewishness. He believed that the future would be good. Now, at the end of his life, or sometime before the end of his life, there was an incident that took place. It shook him to his very core. Here he was accepted by certainly enlightened people, Gentiles, in Berlin. He was even made, he got some awards from the King of Prussia, that is Frederick the Great, but he never got to be a member of the Prussian Academy of Sciences. And one of the reasons for that, said by a Gentile who was sympathetic to the Jews, the only thing that Moses Mendelssohn lacked is a foreskin. Do you understand what that means? I hope you do. He wasn't a Gentile. That's exactly right. But what shocked him at the end of his life, he was walking with his children in Berlin. This is the most respected Jew in all of the German lands. And a group of kids come up to him and his children, and they shout at him, they spit at him and the children, Jude, Jude, Jew, Jew. Even this optimist began to fear that it's always going to be with us, and we have to be on guard. But the point again is, this is the man that tries to get the Jewish people to integrate into modern society. This is the man that defends the Jewish people against all of the insults, showing that the Jews are loyal to their country, the Jews are familiar with secular subjects, the Jews are loyal citizens, all of that kind of thing. And the belief, he says, not only for the Jews, but for the Gentiles, the government of any country does not have the right to repress religion. That is his contribution to Jewish history. And so where does it lead to? Well, what's the problem with all of this? You know what the problem is? Of all of his children and grandchildren, only 2 remain Jews. Only 2. Going down throughout the 19th century. He's dead in 1786. Going way down to the end of the 19th century. The only 2 people in the Mendelssohn family that remained Jews were in fact 2 children. The great, let's say, composer, Felix Mendelssohn, deliberately added to his name Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy in order to demonstrate that he was no longer Jewish. Now, the Haskalah and emancipation are wonderful things for the Jewish people. They really are. You and I are the products of that. Look at what you studied in school. Look at the way you dress. Is there anybody in this place that is wearing tzitzis? The answer is no, with the exception probably of the rabbi. What are the benefits of Haskalah and emancipation? You take a bright Jewish boy, and remember we're talking about a male-dominated society. This is the patriarchy, right? Take a bright Jewish boy. What does he become? He becomes a gifted rabbi, right? Comes the Haskalah, comes emancipation, the Jews and those Jewish boys are like a coiled spring. You take the pressure off, they go right to the top. I'll give you some figures. They're astonishing figures. I mean, they really are. Out of every 100, and this is the year 1900, out of every 100,000 Catholics in Prussia, 33 were in the universities. Of every 100,000 Protestants, 58. Out of every 100,000 Jews, 518. This is not a lecture in Jewish chauvinism. It's simply to make the point to you that the Haskalah, which does play a role in Jewish emancipation, is important. Now, I'll give you an example of how this turns out, not in terms of assimilation to the disappearance of being Jewish, but how it turns out in both a positive, for the most part, a positive way. Some of you may remember our good friend, our dear friend, Yaffa Laun. Yaffa is still here. Yaffa's brother-in-law won the Nobel Prize. All right? And they came from a shtetl in Lithuania, Utyan. He was a gifted boy. The family was a prosperous family. They hired a rabbi to tutor him. On the day he left, the family left Utyan to come to the United States. His rabbinical tutor came and wrote in his Talmud portfolio, "This boy is so smart," in effect, that's what's really the thrust of it. "This boy is so smart that if he perseveres in the study of Talmud, he will be one of the Gaonim, one of the geniuses of our generation." They leave Lithuania. They go to the end of the world, Lewiston, Maine. No more Talmud, no more Yiddish, and you get a man who is a great cardiologist and a winner of the Nobel Prize. That's, again, the dilemma that we're all in. How do you survive in a modern society? That's what Mendelssohn is trying to address. He thinks you can do it. He thinks you can remain Jewish, and to the day he died, he was Shomer Shabbos. This was a traditional Orthodox Jew, a man of the world out in the street, but a Jew in his tent. Can all of us do that? And the answer is no. The proof is there. You take us out of the ghetto, you take us, you open the universities to us, you open the professional schools, and what happens? You get Nobel Prize winners, that's what you get. But do you get people who adhere to the Jewish community? Not always. But that's the dilemma. It was summed up a little bit after Mendelssohn's death by a rabbi in Vilna in the year 1812. That's the year when Napoleon invaded the Russian Empire. It's Napoleon that coined the expression that Vilna was it's translating from the French, but in Yiddish it is, Vilna is the Yerushalayim de Lita, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, because he saw all these Jews in the synagogues and so on. When the French were coming, the French are coming in the name of the revolution. Wherever the French armies went, they tore down the ghetto walls and they emancipated the Jews. Listen to what that rabbi in Vilna said. You'll call him an obscurantist, but he, like Mendelssohn, is addressing an issue relevant to our times. The rabbi says to his congregation, if the French come in, they will liberate us. They will tear down the ghetto walls. They'll emancipate us with everyone else. But we will no longer be Jews. Therefore, I order you to support the Tsar. Who in his right mind would want to support the Tsar? But he's got his finger on something that is very important. I don't want to kick a dead horse here, but that is the basic issue that we confront. Yes, I know. Only an idiot would deny the existence of anti-Semitism in American society and deny its resurgence. It's here. But for nearly every year in which the Jewish people have lived in the United States, including this time, the major issue confronting us is not anti-Semitism, it is the issue of assimilation. For the third time, how do you remain Jewish in a world that is not Jewish, but is free and open to the Jewish people? I mean, do you realize how far you and I have come? From 1920 to 1965, Union College, like most schools in the United States, had a Jewish quota. From 1920 to 1965, no more than 8 to 10% of any incoming class could be Jewish. Harvard started it. As Harvard goes, so goes American education. Columbia had it. All these schools had it. But now it's different. It's very, very different. Everything is open to us. And when everything is open to us, some unfortunate things can take place. And we'll leave it at that. All right. This is a turning point in Jewish history. The Jews have entered modernity, and they will benefit enormously from it, and the rest of society will benefit from the Jewish contributions to history and to ethics and to science and mathematics and physics and medicine. But again, to use the cliche, it's a double-edged sword. Now we go to something that is really malevolent. I bring you back to the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And I go back to the place where most of our ancestors came from, the Russian Empire. By the very end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, Imperial Russia was a pressure cooker. And by that I mean the country was about to burst forward in revolution. The peasants wanted the land, the workers wanted the factories, and the bourgeoisie, the middle class, wanted the right to participate in the political process with a constitution, a parliament, and universal, at least universal, male suffrage. The government was on the ropes. More demonstrations, impending revolution, and a revolution will break out in 1905. The government was not led by a particularly gifted individual. That was Nicholas II. But there were people in the imperial Tsarist government, particularly in an organization known as the Okhrana, O-K-H-R-A-N-A. The Okhrana was the Tsarist secret police. And in the Okhrana, there were people who understood the political value of anti-Semitism. The Germans, some Germans had understood it even before. What had the Germans said? Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune. The message of the right wing in Germany was, if you are hungry, if you are unemployed, if there is a depression, you know who exactly did that. The Jews did that. In Russian, the expression is going to be, Beji dov spasai Rossiyu, beat the kikes and save Russia. In other words, the Tsarist government is going to use anti-Semitism as a political weapon. And the Okhrana came up with the most effective anti-Semitic document that has ever seen the light of day, certainly in modern history. Sometimes that little book is called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Sometimes it is called the Protocols of the Wise Men of Zion. It is a fabrication. It purports to be the secret minutes of an international underground Jewish conspiracy that seeks to enslave the world and create Jewish hegemony over the planet. That's powerful stuff. Very, very powerful stuff. It is so effective as an anti-Semitic weapon that there are groups in our country that continue to publish it. It's almost ubiquitous in the Arab world and in parts of Latin America. So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this idea that the Jews control everything, that they're only interested in the preservation of Jewish life and Jewish wealth, all of these things that people believe down to the present day, they are to be found in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I think I mentioned to you in an earlier lecture, anti-Semitism is not only an effective, it is a coherent and intelligible argument or ideology. The intellectual coherence and beauty of anti-Semitism, I said this to you before, is the ability of anti-Semitism to explain multi-causal phenomena in a monocausal way. Why are we poor? The Jews made us poor. And as I said to you before, why did we lose the war? The Jews stabbed us in the back. Why is there a depression? The Jews are responsible for it. Again and again and again. The man that uses this and plays this anti-Semitic card all the time and is very effective in using it is Reverend Farrakhan. Farrakhan is the man that uses it more often and more effectively than anybody else. All right? So much, again, for the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Then we come to something else. And that is, sometimes a book really does change history. I talked to you, remember, about Uncle Tom's Cabin. We spent time talking about that. There are two books that have changed the course of Jewish history. One we'll talk about next week, the last week. This is a book, the one that I'm talking about, is going to come in the middle of the 1960s, 1966. At that time, Elie Wiesel, in 1965, went to the Soviet Union. And because he is, of course, a fluent Yiddish speaker, he was able to speak with Jews everywhere. And what he found out was something that was a surprise to all of us. And he made it a surprise to all of us and gave us an action what we should do about it. We all thought, remember, this is 65, this is, let us say, almost 50 years since the October Revolution. We knew about the Russian attempts to Russify the Jews. We knew about that. And we believed that the Soviet Union had succeeded. That the Jews had divorced themselves from their religion and from their sense of ethnicity and Jewish consciousness. And when he traveled to Moscow and Leningrad and to other large cities where there were large Jewish populations, he found something that was a shocker, an absolute shocker. Some of the Jews were religious, most of them were not, most of them knew they were Jewish, proud of being Jewish, and they said to him, privately, always in Yiddish, "We want to get out of here." We were shocked, absolutely shocked by that. And that's what he meant. He made clear in The Jews of Silence, telling us that in the Soviet Union there were over 3 million Jews that we American Jews had written off, that Israel had written off, that these people were Jewish. Whether they were religious or not was irrelevant. These people were Jewish. They wanted a sense of Jewish life in Russia or in the Soviet Union, and if possible, many of them wanted to emigrate and go to the state of Israel. That's the book that sparked the Soviet Jewry movement in our country. Elie Wiesel, not merely the great Holocaust historian or writer, but this is a man that played a role in awakening the Soviet Jewish community to a certain extent, but above all, awakening us in American society. We owe an enormous debt to him. Then there are some other things to discuss, and that is, the most important of them, the one that really changes things, is going to be that incredible document that emerged in Vatican II, Nostre Aetate. Literally, that means in our time. To make any sense about what I'm talking about, remember what Catholic doctrine had taught up until 1965. These are what a survivor of the Holocaust, a physician who survived, Jewish physician who survived the Holocaust, but whose entire family was wiped out. This was a Dr. Jules Isaac. And Isaac wrote a book, a short book, in which he used the term, the basic teachings of contempt. He said to the Catholic priests around him in Paris, he said, be honest with yourselves. The Nazis carried out the murder of the Jews. Now, he didn't use this language because it's too harsh. But the Catholic Church had planted the seeds for this by these basic teachings of contempt, some of which I've said to you before. Teaching number one, the Jews at the time of the appearance of Jesus, Judaism was spiritually bankrupt. The Jews worshiped the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. Remember I said to you, what in fact is, what does that mean? What's the story in the New Testament that makes that clear? Jesus chasing the money changers out of the temple. What's the point of the story? Look at the Jews. They're changing money. They're making a buck right near the Holy of Holies. Bad stuff. But the second teaching of contempt is even more significant. I think I mentioned this to you before. I'm even going to use the same language. Homicide is murder, a terrible crime. Parricide, the killing of a parent, is worse than that. Regicide, the killing of a king, is worse than that. We are guilty of the greatest crime, according to the Catholic Church up until 1965, of the greatest crime that has ever been perpetrated on this planet. We're guilty of the crime of deicide. We killed God's only Son. Nothing in the history of the relationship between Jews and Christians, and in the history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, is as important as that. And once again, remember, some of this over the years I've talked to you about, but sometimes I told you, Mrs. Grossman, my second grade teacher, told me repetition is the mother of learning. All right, so you'll bear with me. Here I'm standing on the bima in a synagogue, and I'm telling you, the next time you go to a hotel, open up that side cabinet and look at the Gideon Bible. And look at chapter 27 of the book of Matthew. You can read it in less than 5 minutes. That's all you have to do. It's less than 5 minutes, chapter 27 of the book of Matthew. What is it, of course? Again, there's Jesus. He's accused of heresy by the high priest Caiaphas. Caiaphas orders him to be taken to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate interviews him, accuses, are you guilty of this? Boom, boom, boom. Jesus, as he usually does, answers in riddles. Very hard to find out what he's talking about. But Pilate, in that famous gesture, washes his hands, says, I wash my hands of this, turns to the Jewish crowd and says, what should we do with him, this man? I find nothing wrong with him. And according to Matthew, repeated in the Gospel of John somewhat differently, the Jewish crowd yells out, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate says, why? What has he done wrong? Again, he questions Jesus and then turns to the crowd and says, what should we do with this man? And the crowd not only yells out, crucify him, but may his blood be upon us and our children. There's no subtlety in that. The Jews are accused in the Gospels of killing the Son of God. That is powerful stuff. And the third teaching, God is so angry with the Jewish people, so angry with them, he sent to them his only son who is Jewish. And what did the Jews do? They killed him. That's what they did. Therefore, the other teaching of contempt is God is so angry with the Jews that he has abrogated the covenant with them. There's no longer a covenant between God and the Jewish people. The Jews are no longer the chosen people. There's a new chosen people. Those who follow Jesus, those who accept Jesus, the new Christian faith is the new chosen people. And another teaching, and you see it in the name, we Jews should never use the term Old Testament. Because when you say Old Testament, you are saying that it is superseded by a New Testament. There is indeed a New Testament, but we don't believe that that takes the place of the Old Testament. This is called the idea that the New Testament takes the place of the Old Testament. That's what is known as supersessionalism. That is, it has been the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures, the Tanakh in Hebrew, has been superseded by a New Testament. And Isaac goes to the Vatican. He's a Holocaust survivor. His family has been wiped out with about 77,000 French Jews. He gets a hearing. And the hearing resonates among the College of Cardinals. And so at Vatican II, the issue is raised. It's a difficult issue to resolve this in behalf of the Jews. Tradition is very, very strong. Very strong. The idea that the Jews are culpable for this crime is difficult to shake. Very difficult. And yet, this is going to take place. In section 4 of Nostra Aetate, there are things that are said, that are written there, that are mind-boggling from the vantage point of the Catholic Church. 1, in section 4, the Church says that some Jews did indeed want Jesus dead. But not all of the Jews at that time felt that way. And the Jews of subsequent times cannot be held guilty, for what took place almost 2,000 years ago. So what the Church is saying in Vatican II, throw the crime or the charge of deicide out the window. Do you know, maybe you experienced, fortunately I did not, but for our parents' and grandparents' generation, particularly those who came from Eastern Europe, they would often hear the charge, Christ killer. Now the Catholic Church has said, that's not true. And that's important. Furthermore, in Nostra Aetate, it says that the covenant between the Jews and God is not been abrogated. God does not withdraw his promises. The covenant between the Jews and God, that they are a chosen people, that still is in effect. That is important too. In Nostra Aetate, in section 4, it also says the Roman Catholic Church is no longer going to try and convert Jews to Roman Catholicism. And finally, the Church says it is time for Catholic universities and Jewish institutions and Jewish universities to enter into a dialogue. The Roman Catholic Church has turned the corner. If you shoot back at me that Mel Gibson and his father have not turned the corner, you're absolutely right. Remember, tradition is still very, very strong. And there are some Catholics who cannot accustom themselves to that. But make no mistake, Nostra Aetate changes the course of Jewish history. Our relationship with the Catholic Church has changed. Their teachings in Catholic schools have changed. Certainly this is true in the United States, in Western Europe. What goes on in Eastern Europe, that's a difficult thing. Poland, the Polish people are good sons and daughters of the Roman Catholic Church. So are the Spanish men, women, and children. Not as great as they were before, but nonetheless, some of these old ideas really are difficult to shake. Now, I may have quoted this before to show you the power. Well, I'll talk in ways that will be familiar to all of us. I may have said this, listen, in the middle of the 1930s, The 1930s. The greatest technological feat of the 1930s is that two men, for the first time, made an around-the-world flight. Two men flew around the world, the first time that anybody had ever done this. And who is there in Paris who hears about this on the radio? None other than Leon Trotsky, the brilliant Russian revolutionary. Stalin had thrown him out, would eventually kill him in Mexico City. But that's in 1940, but now we're in the middle of the 1930s. So Trotsky listens to this and then writes an essay in which he says, "We are lucky to live in this remarkable time. Lucky to live in this time. I turn the switch on the radio and a man's voice comes over and tells me about this feat. Remarkable. And that there's an airplane, and then men can fly in this airplane. We are blessed," he would use that term. "We are fortunate to live in this time." And then he goes on to say, "This is Saturday night. Tomorrow morning, tens upon tens of millions of people will go to church, bite into a wafer, a consecrated wafer, and believe they are consuming the body of Christ, and drink consecrated wine and believe they are imbibing his blood." When I tell this to the students at Union, I say to them, this is not being said condescendingly, nor is this peculiar to the Roman Catholic Church. Don't be upset what I'm about to say to you. It's not long ago that many of us came to this synagogue, asked a God that we cannot see, cannot hear, and ask this God that we cannot see and cannot hear, we ask him to forgive us for our sins. Is that rational? Is it more irrational than what some of the Catholics and some of the Christians, some of the Muslims believe? It's very difficult to shake faith. Why is Jerusalem the third holiest city in Islam? Mecca is the first, Medina is the second, but in the Quran it talks about the so-called night passage, in which Muhammad went to Jerusalem, got on a horse, and rode up to heaven. I'll give $100 to anybody in this room who ever saw a horse fly. A horse fly we know, but that a horse can fly, that's something else. I'm not being disparaging of Islam. I'm not. It's very hard to shake faith. And unfortunately for us, anti-Semitism, which is an article of faith, is very difficult to extirpate from society. Now we go to the last book. What time are we here? Holy smokies. Take 3 minutes, tinkle, come back, and we'll talk about the book that people think changed everything. It really didn't, because very few people ever read the book. That's the book Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. That's what we'll talk about after the break. Please take no more than 5 minutes and we'll come back. All right, my friends, if we can begin. If we can begin. All right, my friends, we are going to begin. Hey, Joyce. All right. The last book that we're going to discuss is Mein Kampf. We don't have much time, but let me say to you a number of things. The mystery, the great mystery about Adolf Hitler. Why did he hate Jews so much? This is more within the realm of the psychoanalyst than it is of the historian or the political scientist. I can't tell you. I can tell you what some people have said. The most common explanation is that his mother, to whom he was devoted, his father beat him quite frequently. The father was much older than the mother, beat the young Adolf, really very hard and for a long period of time. He was very devoted to his mother. His mother developed breast cancer. She was treated by a Jewish physician, and the mother died, and he was grief-struck. That doesn't hold up because that doctor who treated his mother actually emigrated and came to the United States and said, when he came here, that his relationship with the teenage Adolf Hitler was a very good one. That Hitler came to see him, he comforted Hitler, and so on. Beyond that, we do not know. Is it just chance? We know that he was down and out in Vienna. He leaves the small Austrian town and comes to Vienna. We know he's down and out. He enters the world of the flop house, and he sells postcards for a nickel or a dime. He's not a bad artist. And to show you, I remember, how many times have we spoken about the fact that chance and accident are very important in history? He made an attempt to enter the leading art academy within Vienna. He was rejected. I think he applied twice, and he was rejected twice. How much of history would have changed had he been in the art academy? I don't know. I can't answer that question. I really can't. I will tell you to lighten up. This has been a sober night, and it's a sober time. Do any of you remember Mad Magazine? Mad Magazine had a section, undelivered letters, which could have changed the course of history. Now, these are all fictitious letters, but one of the letters was from Adolf Hitler's uncle, who was a painter in the Bronx. And the letter that was not delivered was, "Dear Adolf, my beloved nephew, I can get you a job in the Bronx painting houses. I'll send you the money. Why don't you come over?" An undelivered letter. Might have changed the course of history. Just lightening this up. Now, this is a man, another historian has referred to it in the time as something like this. What better time for a man who is at a zero than when population at large, or the country at large, is at zero? Germany was at zero in the aftermath of World War I. The German people had been told, right up until almost November of 1918, one last push by our gallant soldiers, they will break through the lines, they will take the Channel ports, they will take Paris, and the war is over. But it wasn't going to be. Remember, it rolls off like a litany. The war came to an end the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. The Germans had been on the offensive as late as October of 1918. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, and yet they were beaten. They were beaten solidly. And then, compounding this defeat, compounding the humiliation, the Allies socked it to the Germans at the Treaty of Versailles. This is the famous war guilt clause in the Treaty of Versailles, which the Germans are forced to sign. That is acknowledging responsibility, sole responsibility for the outbreak of World War I. And what will not be forgotten, that sometimes we do not talk about this in history classes, in order to make sure that the German delegation to Versailles signed the Treaty of Versailles, acknowledging Germany's war guilt, the British kept the blockade on Germany after the war was over. Any discussion of the reasons for German defeat and Allied victory, there are many reasons for that, but one of the major reasons is the British blockade. By late 1916, early 1917, that's what is referred to in German history as the turnip winter. There's no food. Ultimately, hundreds of thousands of German men, women, and children, large numbers of children, will starve because of this, that blockade. You cannot understand the Nazi accession to power unless you understand it against the strange loss in World War I, strange to a number of people, loss in World War I, the humiliation of Versailles, and the British blockade. The Nazi Party is born in the early 20s. Hitler, twice in his life, only twice in Hitler's life, did he make what comes to be a fatal mistake. He survives the first one barely and does not survive the second. The first one is the abortive putsch of November 9th of 1923. This is a time of inflation. Again, 1914, the rate of exchange, 4 marks to the dollar. 1918, 8 marks to the dollar. 1920, 12 marks to the dollar. At the height of the superinflation, 2 billion marks to the dollar. I don't know, I asked my students, did they still have the same pictures in their history textbooks in high school that I had in high school? And the answer is yes. The 2 famous pictures, some of you may remember. A middle-aged German goes into a grocery store with a barrel full of money, and in the next picture he comes out with a loaf of bread and a bottle of milk. That's the great inflation. It wipes out the middle class, wipes out their savings. And it's going to be a very serious problem. But Germany weathers it. And to give you an idea how it weathers it, 1928. 1928, there's an election. Hitler's Nazi Party receives 800,000 votes out of the 20 million that were cast. That's less than 5%. 800,000 out of 20 million. That's 1928. 1930, 1 year after the Depression sets in, the Nazi Party receives 6.5 million votes. 3 years at the nadir of the Depression, the Nazi Party receives 13,187,000 votes, 37.6% of the popular vote. I told you, as I tell my students on the first day of every class, not of every class, of every session, of every semester, history is not mathematics. It's not A plus B produces C, but sometimes you can come close. This is one of those times that you can come close, showing the impact of the inflation and the depression upon German politics. But before that, he rolls the dice November 9th, 1923. He believes that the time is ripe. And so in Munich, his Nazi party tries to seize power, believing that first we take Munich, then we take Bavaria, and then we take all of Germany. The time was not ripe. The Bavarian police remain loyal. The federal police come out, and they kill a large number of Nazis. These are the first Nazi martyrs. That's why, from 1923 almost till 1945, every November 9th, Hitler and the Nazi Party leaders would go to the beer hall in Munich, from which they set out on November 9th of 1923. If you go to Munich, don't look for the beer hall. I think it was destroyed in a bombing. But the point here is, he rolled the dice and he lost. Now, a number of things are going to be a consequence. He had committed treason. Some policemen had died. In some democratic countries, the penalty for what he did was death or long-term incarceration. We executed people for treason, not only back in the Revolutionary War, but throughout the Second World War. People who betrayed the United States were executed for treason, and we are a democratic country. In Germany, he was not executed. He was treated, again, as a political criminal and sentenced to a short-term imprisonment within the Landsberg prison. His conditions in the prison were so good that he was allowed to conduct the business of the National Socialist Party from prison and was given access to a variety of books in order for him to write Mein Kampf. Now we come to an interesting issue. Remember, we spoke at the beginning of the evening. There are transcendental issues. How do you deal with evil, right? Here's another transcendental issue. How does a democratic society deal with people who want to destroy it? Right? And when I tell my students that, remember, they believe that history begins when they were born. So it's 2023. That means they think that history begins, let's say, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012. But you're real people. You know the debate that raged in American society, a debate that rages down to the present time. Now it's not Adolf Hitler, and it's not the Nazis, but it's Islamic terrorism. So what is the right policy to pursue after 9/11? What's the proper procedure to follow? You know what the argument is all about. What is our response politically to 9/11? What is our response? An act is passed in Congress which continues to exist and resonates right down to the present time. That's the Patriot Act. Does the government have the right to listen to our telephone calls? Does the government have the right to look at our mail? I must tell you, during the Second World War, there was an Office of Censorship. 13,000 civilians were employed by the Office of Censorship during our participation in the Second World War. Every telephone call that went from this country to another country or came in, somebody listened in. Every letter that was sent out, every letter that came in after Pearl Harbor, somebody looked at that. It is a basic question here. That's what's raised here with Hitler. Can a democratic society be too democratic for its own good? What do you do? Again, I said to you, the Patriot Act, Islamic terrorists. What do you do with white supremacists? What do you do with white nationalists? These people have attacked churches and synagogues and other venues as well. How do you deal with them? How do you restrict free speech? Should free speech be restricted? You're going to hear, this you can take to the bank. In the next week or two, people are going to come out on college campuses for sure. They're going to come out on college campuses and say that Israel was responsible for what happened. The Israelis have done terrible things. The Israelis are genocidal murderers, and so on. And there'll be threats, implicit, not explicit threats, to Jewish students and perhaps even Jewish faculty on the campus. What is free speech and what is not? That's an ancient problem in a democratic society. All I can tell you is this. I am a firm believer in the role of personality in history. Had Adolf Hitler been executed, the history of the world would have been very different. Most historians, but not all historians, would agree with me. No Hitler, no Nazi accession to power. No Hitler, no Second World War. No Hitler, no Holocaust. What would have happened had Hitler been executed? Now, the Germans are not the... Why wasn't he executed? It was because the judiciary, and of course, not only the judiciary, but other people had supported the old regime. They didn't like the Doom democracy. They didn't like the Weimar Republic. They wanted the old ways. The judges were people from the pre-1914 order. They saw Hitler as a bastion against communism. They weren't going to put him away. We need him to stop the communists from coming to power. But what do? More history than you ever wanted to know. That's going to be replayed in the end of the second half of the 1950s, and of all places, Cuba. There's Fidel Castro destroying or trying to seize the Monacato barracks in the northern part of Cuba. He's arrested. It's an act of treason. People die. In fact, the order comes from Havana to kill him. But a black sergeant in the police is sympathetic to him and doesn't kill him. So he's brought back on trial, and Batista makes the terrible mistake of putting the trial on radio. And what does Fidel Castro do? He does the same thing that Adolf Hitler does. He turns the tables. That is, Hitler turned the tables on the Weimar Republic. You've sold out to the Jews, blah, 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 blah. And Castro says, you're a tool of the Americans, you're a stooge. Castro says it to Batista. He becomes a hero. How much of the history of Cuba and Latin America would have changed had he did what he should have done, and that is execute Castro? Do you understand what I'm saying here? Chance and history are important, and sometimes people make a mistake. You want to hear another mistake along those lines? There's the Ayatollah Khomeini. He's thrown out of Iran. They throw him out of Iraq. They send him to Paris. The Shah's supposedly invincible Savak has agents all over. What would have happened had they killed Khomeini in Paris? Khomeini will do that to opponents of the Islamic Republic in Paris and elsewhere. The Shah wouldn't do it. I can't answer why he doesn't do it. What is important about Mein Kampf? What are the basic principles? One, Marxism is the greatest evil that has really taken place on our planet in the last 2,000 years. And who's responsible for Marxism? The Jews. The Jews are using Marxism as a place, a central place, or an ideology to destroy the world in behalf of the Jews. What is the center of Marxism? The Soviet Union. And in Mein Kampf, Hitler refers to the Soviet Union as this. Here's the English translation from the German. The Soviet Union is the seat of the Judeo-Bolshevik menace. Marxism is evil. The Jews are responsible for Marxism. The Soviet Union is the world's greatest threat, and the Jews are behind the Soviet Union. Or that terrible sentence, a warning to German women and girls: beware the dark-haired Jew boy who lurks in his corner, wanting to plant the seed into Aryan women, destroying them and destroying society through racial defilement. The Jew is not only evil as an evil race, the Jew is a sexual pervert in the eyes of Adolf Hitler. Marxism, communism, Jewish sexual perversion, all of these things are said again and again and again. It's race against race, Hitler says. The most evil of the race is the Jewish race. They destroy everything that they touch. And if my Third Reich, which I will create, is to last 1,000 years, the Jews have to be eliminated. That's what Adolf Hitler is talking about in Mein Kampf. The joke used to be in Germany that everybody bought the book, but nobody read it. I've read the book. I can understand why people didn't read it. It is a turgid piece of stuff. I mean, it just is really, you don't read Mein Kampf in a horizontal position. You just don't do it. But they didn't have to learn from Mein Kampf. And party leaders and party propagandists, they read Mein Kampf. And what comes out is a doctrine of racial hate. And a racial hate that has no limits. Going back to something that I said to you before, For 1900 years, Christians might see a Jewish boy crossing the street, and they might say to him, let's beat the living daylights out of that Jewish boy. His ancestors killed Jesus. But not with the new racial anti-Semitism of the 19th century, and not with Adolf Hitler. The evil of the Jew is not in his Talmud, not in his Torah, it's in his blood, or today we would say his genes. You don't have to be a wizard of logic to come to the conclusion. If the evil of the Jew is in his blood and his genes, don't think of converting the Jew. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew. The Jew must be exterminated from the face of the earth. Mein Kampf is the first stone in paving the way to Auschwitz. That's the importance of Mein Kampf. Now, along with that comes Hitler's speeches, many, many speeches, in which he talks about, again, what should happen to the Jews. So here we are. All of these things have changed the course of history. For better, and for sometimes for worse. Personality is important, books and ideas are important. All right, enough of this, it's late. I will stay. Are there questions about anything that I said, including the first part of the evening? We talked about what was happening in Israel. I do not have a monopoly on the truth. I'm not the prophet from upstate New York or Union College. I will give you what I think are the best answers that I'm capable of giving. Are there any questions? And if you want to vent, vent, but do it briefly. Are there any questions? Are there any venters? Everything under, yes.
Hi, I guess I'm, do you hear me now? I'm venting in terms of what can we do. I mean, I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, so I have a particular reaction to what's going on, but what can we do to counter all the propaganda that we're all hearing and just the pervasiveness of that propaganda on college campuses and throughout? Thank you.
She's asking, again, a very good question. What do we do combating the evil propaganda that surrounds us? You can't stop it because in the name of free speech, you'll be thwarted if you try to stop it. What you can stop, and you've got to take college administrators to task on this. We live in a marketplace of ideas. You can say whatever you want. What you can't do is to bully, to intimidate, and to physically assault people who really don't share your point of view. Any college administrator that doesn't take that and doesn't implement a policy on the basis of what I just said to you should be fired. And that is really the only thing that you can do. I also said in the speech on Monday that I gave for the Federation, every Jew, every supporter of Israel must be an emissary in behalf of Israel. You can't be afraid. You can't be afraid to speak out. And you've got to be informed enough. I'll get to the question. You've got to be informed enough to know what the charges are and to be able to answer them. What are you going to hear all the time? Yeah, I've heard it all the time. Well, Hamas, they had no other recourse because the Jews put them in a blockade. That's true. Israel and Egypt, they forget to say that Egypt put them in the blockade too. Egypt and Israel put Hamas in a blockade, put the Gaza Strip in a blockade. And the reason for that was Hamas called for the destruction of Israel, carried out terrorist attacks against Israel. If Israel did not have a blockade, what happened on October 7th would not be simply dealing with infiltrators, but with planes and tanks and heavy artillery. That's why there's a blockade. And the blockade could have come to an end at any time, as it could still come to an end. If the leaders of Hamas said, enough is enough, we recognize the state of Israel, you give us a Palestinian state, and it's all over. That's what Sadat did. Sadat came to Jerusalem and told the people of Israel, give me back the Sinai, and we will have peace between Egypt and Israel. And Menachem Begin, bless his soul, who before all of this swore in a pack of Bibles, we won't give them El Arish, we won't give them the Sinai, we won't give them Sharm el-Sheikh. He gave it all back. But Hamas is not prepared to do that. And that has to be made clear. Don't be reluctant to refer to Hamas as a genocidal organization. More than that, I cannot tell you. Just don't be afraid.
Hi, I just wanted to share something that I was hearing, read about and saw today, that some financial leaders of major firms, most of them seem to have names that seem to be Jewish, are identifying the people in Harvard who signed a letter supporting Hamas and said, we're not going to hire these people, because if we hire these people, I don't want to be around people like this or the Ku Klux Klan. I don't want to socialize them, and I certainly don't want to have them in my company. At least 5 of the organizations at Harvard said, oh, we didn't really mean to sign that, or that doesn't reflect us. That's at least an example that seems to be very potent. I think it's superficial at this point in terms of what the kids are saying, the organizations, but it's a wonderful start because no one's had it. We've also had situations where the 10 most prominent people on social media, mostly celebrities, spoke out immediately when Ukraine was attacked, but crickets over Israel. That being pointed out is a start, and things like that are examples of maybe a little bit of turning, or the inertia, the momentum is not going forward as much as before.
All right. Let me say to you, if you really want to talk tachlis, I've asked the rabbi, I've asked people. I read a lot of newspapers each day. Correct me, I may have missed something. I have not seen a leading Muslim cleric in the United States condemn what took place. Maybe I missed it. I haven't seen a single one. There's something known as civic courage. Not physical courage, civic courage. Sometimes you got to speak out. They're not speaking out. In our community, there are people, I don't believe that they are correct, but they have the right to say what they want. That is, there are some rabbis, usually in the Reform movement, who are very quick to criticize Israel. And now you hear talk about, Israel's got to stop because civilians are dying, and so on. Our people, our rabbis, are willing to speak out. I don't agree with that, but they're willing to speak out. Why are Muslim clerics not speaking out? Although the rabbi has said that the man that we have been associated with in this congregation for many years, the man with a very strange name, Genghis Khan, did call him and offered comfort. But nowhere else. Nowhere else. Now that leads to another question, the most politically incorrect question of them all. Is there something wrong with Islam? Is it that some of these Muslim clerics are really afraid? Again, like some black leaders were afraid in an early period of time to condemn anti-Semitism in the African American community because they would have problems. I understand that. Is this the case with Muslim clerics? Or are there parts in the Quran and in the Hadith that talk about the right to rape heretics? To kill babies? I don't know. I don't know. I can tell you if I said this to a newspaper man, we would all be in trouble. This is a real issue here. I mean, we are talking about people being burned alive. I can tell you, this I do know, when ISIS was doing things like that, the clerics, the Muslim clerics that were associated with ISIS, referred to passages in the Quran and in the Hadith that said that this was the right thing to do. We all know, even in the Jewish scriptures, in the Talmud, there are some harsh things that are said about people of other religions. We know that. Every religious tradition says on occasion some harsh things about other religions. The difference is, in the modern period, nobody says those things anymore. Nobody acts on the basis of those things anymore. I mean, after all, I just told you that in the Catholic Church, up until Nostra Aetate, the Jews are Christ killers. And you can bet your last buck that there are still Catholics that think that the Jews are Christ killers, yet they don't go out and kill Jews. What do you do with a religion that speaks of jihad? What do you do with a hadith that says, and it's quoted all the time by those who are hostile to Israel, on Judgment Day, the tree will say to the Muslim, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, kill him. The rock will say to the Muslim, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, kill him. What do you do with that? Are the overwhelming majority of Muslims moderate and peace-loving? The answer is yes, of course it is yes. But what do you do with those people who go to what they consider their tradition, believe it that's holy writ, and act on the basis of it? I mean, where do you see this in our own time? And a very unfortunate thing in Israel, with a number of usually settlers, but sometimes not settlers, but part of the Haredim. They see a Christian and they spit on the Christian. That's terrible. It's absolutely disgusting. But spitting on a person is not killing a baby. Something is wrong. All right, anybody else? Go ahead. Yes, Alan.
What do you see as the end game for Hamas and the Gaza Strip, say, for the next year? What is going to happen?
Alan, you're such a good friend and such a smart guy. Why would you put me in this impossible situation with this question? It is a good question. It's the question that everybody is asking. If Israel goes into Gaza, it will cost the Israelis several hundred dead. And since a lot of Hamas people are in tunnels, even if you go into Gaza, you're not going to be able to root them all out. And if you take Gaza and you hold on to Gaza, it's going to cost Israel a fortune. They'll pay a blood price because people come out from the tunnels and the sewers and they'll kill Israelis. But if you leave Gaza, Hamas will come back. I don't know. My students accuse me of a multitude of sins. Waffling is never one of them. Your question is a very good one, and I don't know and I don't think the Israelis know the answer as well. The immediate aim of the Israelis is to get the hostages out. And I'm afraid that when they get the hostages out, either because they get them out, they're able to literally get them out, or because it's a negotiated settlement, part of the negotiated settlement will be that the Israelis have to cease bombing Gaza and have to withdraw from the city. God bless you. You know what that means? A reprisal in 5 years. Another attempt. That's the question of the day. You're absolutely right. What's the long-term plan for the Israelis? Anything else? All right. The good thing is the course is almost over, right? You won't have old Prof. Burke to kick around anymore. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for coming on behalf of the Adult Education Committee. We thank Dr. Burke for such a phenomenal lecture series. And thank you for coming. And don't forget to come next Thursday for the last lecture, which is Zionism and Israel. Thank you.